Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. Got a report out from JP Morgan stating inflation is most likely going to remain high for the next 10 years. Let's dive into this and see if I agree. I might have some pushback here, although I agree on the overall idea, may have some pushback as far as the logic that JP Morgan is using. So let's go right over to this article from Zero Hedge. And I guess before we get to the JP Morgan part, we'll kind of start with the overall argument. 10 years to 2%. We said bone chilling because it has direct analog to the 1970s Great Inflation, in which they got inflation temporarily under control in 1976, just in time for the bicentennial celebration, only to unleash hell soon afterwards. Our forefathers said to us then, they have taken big risks to create inflation under control and keep the celebration positive for business. Watch what happens after 4th of July. Our father said to us then. Okay, maybe he's talking about the author's father or something like that. Okay. And but I have watched debates with Milton Friedman back around this time with several prominent Keynesian economists, and most of them were saying that they thought that inflation now was dead, and any talk about it after 1976 was just kind of a nothing burger. And Milton Friedman said, "Well, I tend to disagree," and I don't know that they called him a tinfoil hatter, maybe behind his back. And he said that it had to do with the monetary supply. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now, I don't want to go way off on a tangent, but what I will say is most people, including many of you watching right now, misinterpret what Milton Friedman meant by inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Most people take that as Friedman was saying, if you have an increase in the money supply, you will therefore have inflation. That's not what he was saying, but again, we'll have to save that for a whiteboard video. Getting back to the live stream, we'll keep going down the article, and as a result of that prediction, the outcome has been we're all aware of. Okay, blah blah. I guess he's talking about the 1970s. Now he goes on to discuss what Zoltan Pozsar has said, that inflation will be here for at least 5 more years. But what is inflation? I mean, how are you defining that? Inflation can be 100%. It can be 1%. There's a big range there. 2% inflation is a fairy tale translating into even worse inflation after the next recovery, 10-year investor outlook. Now we get down to JP Morgan. And there's a quote: the Fed typically will hike until Fed funds exceeds CPI, which intersect in May 2023, according to the Fed's, I guess, projections. Should our Fed and CPI forecast prove correct? Should CPI prove a bit more stubborn than forecast, could we see the Fed continue to raise with a series of 25 basis point hikes beyond the March meeting? Conversations with our EM client base reveal views that Fed funds likely needs to reach 6 to 7% range. And keep in mind, guys, today at 2 p.m. Eastern, the Fed is going to make their rate hike announcement. So we're going to be right back on this channel covering that. So they say, why are they making this assertion that the Fed needs to get up to 6 to 7%? Why? For DM countries that see CPI exceed 5%, it usually takes 10 years, or they say it takes 10 years for CPI to fall back to 2%. Okay, here is where I want to push back on, it looks like JP Morgan, and kind of what this author of this article is saying. Let's go over to a chart from the New York Times, and not not sure I can increase this. Let me try to increase the size so everyone can see it. Okay, here we go. So I want you to notice first and foremost that we got to, I did it on an earlier chart. You can't see the exact rate here, but just in 2008, prior to the GFC, inflation got up over 5%. And it did not take 10 years to get back down to 2%. Probably took 10 days. So I don't know if they're just using overly broad language. I mean, another thing that I would point out right here in 81, we got up to 14%. So by 1986, we were below 2%. That is not 10 years. And then if the argument is, well, that's because they took real interest rates positive, I would just suggest that they look at a chart of the 1940s, where in 1947, we had the rate of inflation at 19%. 19. And a year, 2 years later, inflation was at negative 2%, not 2%, negative 2%, meaning 2% deflation. Did the Fed take rates up to 20% to have positive real rates? Absolutely not. In fact, if my memory serves me right, they were at zero because they had a pegged yield curve. I know definitively they didn't take rates above 2.5% because they had the long end of the curve pegged at around 2.5%. Now, Fed funds might have got up to 50 basis points or something like that. That's a far cry from 19% inflation. So it's just not true. And I think JP Morgan is falling victim to something that I criticize the Dave Ramsey types all the time. And most of the financial quote unquote gurus that are on social media and on YouTube. And this is that they just cherry pick. They just only go back and they just use charts going back to 1981 as if the whole global economy started in 1982. I mean, it's just crazy. But even taking it from 1982, I don't see how they can come to that conclusion when I mean, you're real darn close right here as well. In fact, I think you probably are. I mean, I can't see the exact dates on this chart, but if we go look at 1991, we're at over 6%, and looks like 1999, we got under 2. So it's almost the opposite of what they're saying. In the past, when we've gotten to 5%, we get to 2%. I mean, sometimes almost immediately, let alone in 10 years. So I think the main takeaways here, if you want my personal opinion, my base case, again, no certainties, only probabilities, but I do think that the 2020s will be an inflationary decade, just like the 1940s, 1970s. But I do not think that there's a very low probability that we will not see 2% or sub 2% over the next decade, especially assuming the yield curve is right and we get a significant recession, if not a financial crisis. I mean, in a financial crisis, you're telling me that if we have another GFC, that the inflation rate won't go below 2%? Now, granted, it probably won't stay there because of the government's response to the GFC 2.0. But come on, you can't just say that, oh, well, it won't get below 2% for a sustained period of time. No, below 2% is below 2%. I don't care if it happens just for a week or two. So those are my thoughts on the report, Zero Hedge, JP Morgan, etc., on future inflation for the rest of this decade. And that takes us right up to the next big topic of discussion, which is going to be at 2 o'clock today, 2 o'clock Eastern time. The Fed is going to come out and announce, are they hiking 25 basis points, 50, 75? And probably more importantly, what will this rate hike do to the yield curve? That's what we're going to explore here, right, on this channel in about an hour and a half. As always, guys, make sure you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Stand up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism. See you in the next video.